Here we come to one of my favorite topics, inflation. Um, and not that I like inflation. In fact, I think inflation is one of the more evil things in the world that ever was invented because it's one of the greatest lies ever told. And I think it's pretty destructive to most countries. I'm trying to remember, I think it was Lenin, the leader of Soviet Russia at the beginning. He said the best way to destroy a country is to debauch the currency through inflation because not one person in a million understands what's going on. All right? So, inflation is the monster under the bed. It is the evil thing that pervades everything, and it's tough to see and understand. But once you get it, then all kinds of possibilities are open to you. All right? And so this is really going to be able to explain how you can get rich and why rich people understand this. And there's so many things. Okay? So let's get into the basics in this one, and we'll do several episodes. All right. So inflation is the general increase in prices. The general price of everything is just going up. That is inflation. And so it's not any one thing, it's a general rise in prices. And that's what you've got to keep in mind. Because there are, sectors of the economy that will see more or less of something declines and all that. But we're going to take a look at this here. So cost push inflation is when the cost of making goods or services goes up in general. And something that would cause a general rise in prices due to the cost going up, there's usually only two things. The first one is oil. If the price of oil goes to $10, then every product on the shelf goes up because everything has to be shipped to the store or shipped to your house if you order it online. And so if the price of oil goes up, then you're going to see cost push inflation. It's a general rise in prices in most things. The second one is minimum wage increases. Because every product out there is made with labor, some point along the chain, if you increase the minimum wage, you will see the cost of doing business pushing the prices up. I love going to Casa El Mirador. It's one of my favorite restaurants. And every time I go in January, I see new menus and I go, oh no, because what happened is the state of Oregon has raised the minimum wage, and so my restaurant has raised its prices, and that's why they put out the new menus. So, yeah, this is cost push. It's pushing the prices up because the costs are going up, and so you just have to charge more for things. The second kind, we don't see this one too often, is demand pull. So it's an increase in consumer tastes and preferences. So the price of Xboxes or PlayStations will go up. If they come out with a really cool game and you have to buy their console, then you have to buy it. And so everyone goes out and buys it. And that demand just pulls the price up because people want it. They're basically bidding against each other for a limited supply. Now in America, we just very rarely have limited supplies of things. Usually we're overproducing most of our stuff and then trying to convince people that they really need it, and so we're trying to get them to buy it. But in a lot of places in the world, demand pull inflation does exist because there's not enough to go around, and so people say, well, $8, $9, $10, $11, and so the seller can then just keep raising that price because people are bidding it up. This is 2020, so right now there's a huge housing boom in the Dalles. There's a lot of people wanting houses in the Dalles, and there's not enough supply to go around. So what happens to the price of the homes is that they inflate. They go up, right? Because people are bidding the prices higher and higher and higher, and that's what's happening. All right, so those are some examples that you could look at there for cost push and demand pull inflation. But notice, I'm just talking about the housing sector when I talk about demand pull. A general rise in prices, that's kind of tough, okay? There are a few things that do that, and we're going to talk about that in the next episode, but we'll just do the basics right here. How do we measure inflation? We do something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. It's the Consumer Price Index. Okay? So if people talk about, well, what's CPI? Then you understand that's the Consumer Price Index. What they do is the Federal Reserve and the Bureau of Labor and Statistics go back and forth on this, but they create a basket of goods. So, they have to be things that have been around for a while, and they try and measure a base year like 2010, and then they go forward for 10 years, and they take that same basket of goods. How much is the average did this cost in 2010, 2011, 2012? And so that same basket of goods, they go forward 10 years, and they can see, did those prices go up? Did some of them went down? Some of them stayed the same. And then they take that average and they say, on average, Consumer Price Index, the CPI went up 2% or 4% or something like that. And there is a ton of economists that work at the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. I mean, just calculating like food costs, healthcare costs, big screen TV costs. I mean, just all the products that are out there. There's a lot of people working on those statistics because folks want to know how that works, and then central planners and a lot of governments want to try and make that work the way they want it to. Okay? So the Consumer Price Index is where we go to look for inflation rate. It's the same thing. When I've had employees, and then I would, look at this and think about, well, if inflation is 4%, then I should probably give my employees like a 4% increase in their wages so that they can just keep even with that. All right. So that's going to come into play later, and we'll talk about that as well. But Consumer Price Index measures the inflation rate. Now there's some problems with that because the current set of central planners at the Federal Reserve, they really want to print money. Okay? And it looks really bad if you print money because it causes inflation. But if you can hold the inflation numbers down, it gives you room to keep printing money, and people are left going, well, they say it's low, but it doesn't seem like it. But okay. So if you go to Bureau of Labor and Statistics and you look at the CPI, those are the generally accepted numbers, and they usually range around 2 to 4% like all the time. Okay? And in the last few years, they've been ranging at like 0.5% or 1%. It's been really low. But if you go to Shadow Stats, it's a great place for looking at information historically. So Shadow Stats will say, okay, if we calculated inflation now like we did in the 1980s, then our inflation rate would be like, 15%. And if we calculated inflation now like we did in the 1990s, our inflation rate would be like 12%. And so these 2 to 4 kind of things, what ShadowStat does is it says, now look, they keep changing the target, and that's how they keep inflation low. Because what Bureau of Labor and Statistics and the Fed do is they say, okay, but we're not going to count some things. So right now they say that they don't take into account food or fuel costs because that's too volatile, and so we're not going to include that in CPI. Well, if you just include things like the price of computers, which has been going down over the years, your inflation rates looks really low. And they've started to do things like not include like the cost of college. Well, college has been rocketing upward at like 1,500% in the last decade. But if you put that out, well, then your inflation rate looks pretty tame, doesn't it? So Shadow Stats is really good at showing you like this is what we used to calculate, this is what we used to, and this is what we do now. You can make those comparisons. So they're not even the tinfoil hat people that are saying like, oh, it's totally different form. They're just showing you historically what the formulas used to look like. And so if you keep changing your target, well, you can keep the official rate at whatever you want. So keep that in mind as people look at like healthcare costs going upward at hundreds of percent, education costs going up 1,000%. Yeah, so it depends on what you measure. So keep that in mind when you take a look at these things. Because my first year that I went to college in 1989, it cost me $2,000. Like for the whole year. That was 3 terms at Oregon State. Okay? Yeah, that, that's something to think about. All right. And so next, what we want to look at is nominal versus real. So nominal just means the number. So let's say we're going to take into effect, if we'll do this in class, but we'll look at how much was the highest total box office movie ever? What's the highest gross total? And the nominal number is what you'll Google and it'll spit out. And it'll say, I don't know, something like Avatar or something like that. Or it'll be like Return of the Jedi. It'll be some fairly recent movies, things that were big blockbusters and stuff like that. Okay? So that's what the total number is. And if you rank them, you just say, well, this was the biggest, that was the biggest, that was the biggest. We'll look them up in class. Okay? And that's the total number. But what that doesn't account for is it doesn't account for inflation. See, if prices are generally rising over time, then whatever is the latest movie, it's actually not Return of the Jedi, it's probably some Avengers thing now that I think about it. Whatever the latest movie is, that's the greatest thing of all time. You know, they always want to say that because what they're using is the nominal number. So if the price of movies has just been going up over time, then of course the movies that have come out the latest will always have the highest number because they have inflated the prices. So what you have to do is divide today's numbers by the inflation rate over time, and then you can measure something called the real versus nominal, the real whatever it is. So real, for your notes there, means adjusted for inflation. A real number is adjusted for inflation. So if we've had like 110% growth in movie prices, well then you've got to take that today's number and reduce it by 110%. And then all movies, depending on when they came out, in the 70s it would be 60% reduced, in the 50s it would be 40% inflation. You have to measure all movies from the beginning of when movies came out, adjusted for their inflation rate. And then what you're getting is the real rate. And it turns out that the greatest, highest grossing movie of all time is actually Gone with the Wind. Okay? So, very old movie actually brought in far more dollars in real terms than it did in measuring in nominal terms. So if we look at, the latest Avengers movie, of course it grossed like $1 trillion, but, the $1 million back here was worth a lot more than the $1 trillion today. It's not that much, all right? So that's the power of asking this question and thinking about it in those terms, because you have to adjust for inflation, because people who sell things are always going to tell you the nominal number if it's in their best interest. They're always going to say, oh, this is the best thing ever. Is it really? Is it adjusted for inflation? They go, oh, well, no. Okay. Another area you see this is on the news, because the news wants to sell, terrible things, exciting things, awful things, because they want you to keep watching the news. And they want you to be scared, angry, freaked out all the time so that you're right there. What's happening today? And you want to log onto their website, you want to turn into their program. And so the news always overinflates things. So which number do they use? They always use nominal numbers. So classic things like the hurricane season this year was the most deadly and dangerous of all time. Measured in dollars, it was the most expensive hurricane season ever. And you're like, whoa, man, things must really be falling apart on this planet. Okay. In nominal terms, yeah, it's always going to be the worst. And you know what's going to be worse? Next year. Because if inflation goes up, whatever happens next year is going to be more expensive too. So if you adjust these kind of things for real dollars, you're going to find some of the worst hurricanes were like back in 1906. You know, when one of them, that we didn't even name storms back then, but wiped out the town of Galveston and killed 6,000 people. Well, it's pretty bad, you know? And so if you quote the nominal number, it will always be worse every year. And you'll say things like, hurricanes are just getting more expensive. Like, yes, they are in nominal terms, but they're not in real terms. So this is part of your education so that you can open your eyes and see the world for what it is and what's going on. And so understand that when people are trying to sell you something, they're always going to quote the nominal versus the real. They're going to take advantage of every which one, and they're going to give you the one that gives them the most advantage. So you are educated now. You understand that you should always ask for, is that the real number? Is that in real dollar terms? Have you accounted for inflation? If you ask those questions, you'll get the truth. For example, GDP. Okay? So what we've been talking about is anything so far, but nominal GDP, it goes up every year. In fact, it goes up by the inflation rate every year, okay? So it has to go up by the inflation rate. So the real GDP is how much it goes up above the inflation rate. So if your inflation is 2% and your GDP is 5%, then what did your economy really go up by? It went up by 3%. It went up by the difference between them. See, 2% of your GDP growth, that's just inflation. It's just the general rise in prices. It's just the numbers going up. It's not real. It's nominal. So if your GDP goes up 5%, you got to subtract for the 2, and really, it only went up 3%. Okay? Now do you understand why some people at the government are going to be funny with the numbers? Because if your inflation rate is 15% and your GDP is 5%, you're actually losing money. Your country is actually going down if that was the case. But if you change the figure to 2, hey, look, we grew 3% last year. And everyone goes, oh, that's pretty good. Okay? And they do things like they go out and invest and they buy stuff and then they overextend. And then you hear all these stories like people are going broke. Like they can't afford everything and they're up to their eyeballs in debt on credit cards. And because there's a reason. Prices are going up faster than our GDP. So if you use shadow stats numbers, we have a negative GDP. Our country is actually shrinking, not growing. So it behooves the government quite a bit to keep these numbers really low for inflation so that we can always say we're growing in GDP terms. All right? So, yeah, you got to think about these things. First of all, don't ever go with nominal. Always ask for the real. And then when you ask for the real, think about these CPI numbers. Are they for real? I mean, think about the incentives. Does the Bureau of Labor and Statistics have an incentive to keep their numbers low? So you remember, always think about that in economics. It's about the incentives. And if people have an incentive to do something, odds are they're going to do it. All right? So that should give you some things to think about here. And hopefully you understand inflation a little better. We're going to get into the math of that next time.